is a worldwide issue, a national issue, and a local issue. So it's a great topic for us to discuss today. I'm happy to introduce to you the speakers from the English-speaking union who have had their whole semester off to travel around the United States and just debate on whatever topic people ask them to in whatever circumstance. They're very flexible people. This is supported by the English-speaking union and the National Communication Association. And I want to first introduce to you Mary Nugent. Mary's just graduated from the University of Cambridge with a degree in social and political sciences. While she was studying for her degree, she was the director of debating at the Cambridge Union Society. And Mary was actually ranked among the top 10 speakers in the English national tournament and won 4 inter-varsity competitions, including the UK's women's competition. She's originally from Hereford, which is near the Welsh border, and she's going to be working for a member of parliament when she goes back to the UK this month. Then I'd like to introduce to you Lewis Ewu. Lewis was raised in London. He graduated in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford. At Oxford, Lewis won the 2008 World University Debating Championships that were held in Thailand, and also served as the president of the New College Student Government and the president of the Oxford Union Student Union. He's currently in law school in London, and he even has a law firm job lined up in May. Pretty impressive. He's a member of an Institute for Public Policy Research, which is a center-left think tank. Each student will give a 6-minute constructive speech, which means building the case for their position. The topic today is posted right there. Resolved, in the age of globalization and free trade, nations should provide significantly greater flexibility for human migration between and among countries. Mary will speak first for the affirmative, which means that she's arguing for the change, for increased migration. Then there will be a 2-minute questioning period between the debaters. Then Lewis will speak 6 minutes against the proposition, and there'll be time for questioning, and then they'll each get a 3-minute rebuttal speech. Our job as the audience is to be the judges, and of course at the end I will ask by a show of hands who votes for the affirmative, for the change in policy, who votes for the negative. Please remember that these people are not wedded to their positions. So if you don't like one of their points of view, it's not personal. They're debating the best they can on that point. We're very happy to have our guests with us today, and I hope you'll give a warm welcome to Mary and Lewis.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Marlene, for such a great welcome. We've had a really good time so far staying with you, and this is our final and 20th stop on the tour, our 20th college. We're really excited that it's in this week of exciting international events, so thanks very much for the welcome. I'm going to talk to you about 4 things in my speech. I'm going to firstly talk to you about why in our global age, country borders are arbitrary and not that meaningful, and we shouldn't be respecting them in terms of flow of people. I'm secondly going to talk about why it's economically beneficial for countries to allow more flexibility in terms of immigration. Thirdly, why it's socially beneficial. And lastly, and probably most importantly, why it's most just and fair to allow people to move to countries when they want to and not to constrain them within countries and ban them from other countries just because of their nationality. I don't think that's fair. So firstly, quite briefly, what do we mean by this topic? This is a principal debate about the effects of migration. None of us are experts on how many exact numbers of people should be moving between countries. But I'm talking here about a substantial increase. Let's say, for the sake of argument, maybe 50% of current levels of immigration should increase in countries. That's an arbitrary level picked out of nowhere, but it's about a substantial increase, not just a small number, lots more people moving. We're still going to have the kind of border checks and security controls to help prevent crime and to stop people moving across borders for criminal reasons. And there may well be some limits initially to let these changes happen smoothly so infrastructure isn't crushed and people aren't suddenly flooding countries when they can't cope with them. So this is a sensible debate about the pros and cons of immigration, about substantially increasing. So number one, why are country borders arbitrary? Because we say in the global age, when companies, for example, have places and have, say, stores or branches across countries, they're multinational companies, it doesn't make sense to see the world in nation states, confined to one specific nation state and only within that border. Companies and businesses and economies are so interlinked nowadays. Trade is so interlinked, where you might have one product which is produced in 5 different countries in different stages of the production line, that that it doesn't really make sense to see the world through nations. But further, people don't really see themselves in only one nation anymore. So many people have family in different countries, have lived in different countries across their lives. Increased technology and transport links mean it's so much easier to be a global citizen rather than a national citizen. So given that's how companies and economies and trade and people see themselves in the world, why does it make sense in this day and age to limit people to where they can live by those borders? So that's the first point. Country borders are arbitrary. The second point is about why it's economically beneficial for countries to do this, to increase immigration. Why? Well, firstly, because multinational corporations, like I've just said, often work across the world and not just in one country. So multinational corporations are much better suited and can thrive much better in a country if they're allowed to get workers from any country that fits their skills. So very specialized labor, for example, might suffer in a country that doesn't have lots of people in that industry if they can't get people from other countries, right? If they're very limited to only the people who live in that country already, if they're a specialised labour force and they want a very specific type of person. But also we say in the global world and in this kind of day and age of economic change, a country's economy needs to define itself and change constantly as there are new types of economies emerging. And for that, we need a flexible labour force. We need to immediately and very quickly get a new group of people to work on a specific industry that we don't already have. So that might be because of specific skill set, or just because you need a greater group of people to work. So the UK economy has been massively boosted by being able to have more immigration from Europe with a free trade border you have in Europe. So in Europe, you can live and work in any country in the European Union. That's massively boosted the ability for countries like the UK, but so many other countries in Europe to grow because they've got an increased labour force. And when they need to, when the economy is lacking in a particular type of person, they can come without having to change their laws later on. So why is it that's economically beneficial? Why is it socially beneficial? Well, it's socially beneficial because we learn more from having a greater diversity of culture. We learn more from understanding each other better by having different worldviews living in the same place and working together, because that's often what it's about when we're talking about immigration, often driven by labour force changes. We learn from other traditions, from other people. We come to understand people better, and we don't put people in boxes and say everyone should be the same. People are much more free to live how they want to. There's a greater diversity of people where people understand there's not just one way to live and one way to see the world, but many ways. That makes for a better society, both for the people already living there, who may suffer from a very homogeneous kind of community where they feel like everyone has to be one way, but also from people who come, who get to experience new experiences. So lastly, and probably most importantly, why is this a just and fair policy in the world today? Well, we say on this side, I say on this side, why should freedom of movement depend on your nationality? Why should you only be allowed in a country because you happen to have been born in that country, or born in a country which that country happens to like politically? We don't think that's a fair way of living and governing a country. It's entirely arbitrary, and it's entirely down to luck what country you're born in. This idea of the birth lottery shouldn't have any sway on the life you live. It's just your luck whether or not you're born in the United States or whether you're born in Zimbabwe. Why should that luck dictate your life chances and dictate your freedom of movement in the rest of your life? If you want to have a life in America, but you don't happen to have been born in America, and you're born in a country that America doesn't like, why is it more just that that person who's American can have that life you want to live, but you can't? We need an answer from Lewis about why that's a fair way to govern a country. It's in the same way you wouldn't say the colour of someone's skin shouldn't dictate where they can live. Why should the accident of birth dictate where they should live? That's absolutely not a just way of deciding things. So what have we told you today? I've told you that economies, when they have to be flexible and when they have to work under the idea that the world is a global world where countries and trade and companies are so interlinked, it doesn't make sense economically to limit movement by the nation borders, which are so arbitrary anyway nowadays. I've told you that we get better societies when we have a more diverse range of people, when people understand there's so many different ways to live and individuality can be celebrated rather than be ignored by the fact that there's a very singular type of person living in a place. But lastly, I've told you it's just and fair because the lottery of birth, just the chance of where you happened to be born in this world, shouldn't dictate the rest of your life. I urge you to propose.
Okay, a couple of questions. So, do you support the existence of some restrictions on immigration?
Yeah, so some for things like crime, and then initially
Okay.
to make sure the flow
Right.
is okay.
So although you think it's arbitrary that some people were born in one country and not another country which happens to be more developed, you're still happy for some people not to be allowed in?
Well, for the sake of like this working practically, for the sake of countries not being flooded and everyone, both people coming and both people living there, suffer, it doesn't make any sense.
Okay, what's the unemployment rate in the United States right now?
Kind of high.
Okay, so you think with high unemployment in the United States, it makes sense increasing the number of people coming into the United States by 50%. What effect do you think that might have on the unemployment rate?
Okay, but it's not as simple as simply saying more people equals more unemployment, because often increased immigration creates new industries. A lot of immigrants come and create businesses.
What industries do you think will be created?
But a lot of immigrants come and create business and are entrepreneurs, for example. So I don't think it's necessarily true to say more people equals more unemployment.
Why would immigrants create new industries when people cannot get capital who live already in the United Kingdom to build new industries? What makes these immigrants so special, especially when they don't have things like permanent residency, they don't have things like the security that a house would bring them, or they don't have the confidence of their banks? How on earth are they going to get capital to develop?
Well, sometimes immigrants come with capital. You're making an assumption here that no immigrants come with capital. They're just restrained by the visa laws in the US that they can't come at all. So that's the first issue. But secondly, also, some immigrants will work for a while and make enough money to do that. If you actually look, immigrants in most countries tend to be the most productive and the most entrepreneurial.
I've just got one last question. Do you think it's important for a developing nation to have doctors, teachers, and lawyers?
Absolutely, but I'm not sure why.
Thanks. That's all I want to know. So it's okay. And just one last question: how will you decide the people coming into these countries? What criteria would you use to decide if somebody can move into your country or not?
Probably on things like the way the current system works, so things that are useful to the country and other reasons. But ultimately, in the end, we want open borders. That's the end goal.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Thank you very much again to Maryland for hosting us. We've had such a good time here, and it's always a pleasure to be part of a long tradition of debating against or in front of American audiences. So we're proud for that opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, our effort should be concentrated on helping developing countries develop, and we should use free trade as a tool to make sure we can have all countries around the world be as prosperous as America or United Kingdom. I agree with Mary that the random birth lottery is bad. Some people are unlucky to be born into societies which don't have enough resources. That means we should use free trade to spread and develop countries around the world, but not necessarily massively increase migration. Two quick pieces of rebuttal before I go on to 2 points. My first point is going to be about why this damages developing nations, and my second point is about why this creates huge social harms. But two things. Mary, first of all, said, look at the United Kingdom and look at the example of EU immigration, and that's been a success. That's a lie, ladies and gentlemen. There have been 300,000 Polish immigrants, just from Poland alone, who've moved to the United Kingdom, but have often moved to areas with huge amounts of unemployment. You can go to parts of East London, and you see literally people walking around the streets not having any jobs. Because, surprise, surprise, when you move to an area with lots of unemployment, you're probably not going to find a job easily. Or, in a worst case scenario, you depress wages because there's so much labour which you basically offer for free. Her next point was that, well, basically, the great thing about lots of migration and increasing migration by 50%, by the way, that's a big number, you can learn about different cultures. Well, you know, I know a lot about the American culture from watching Family Guy and The Simpsons, right? Like, the great thing about globalization is that things like music, film, and TV, you know, I listen to Jay-Z, I listen to Lady Gaga sometimes, you know, it's possible for you to learn and appreciate the world culture around you without physically being in another country. Furthermore, why not increase the amount of tourism coming into a country so people can come and visit a country and then go back? We have no problem with that. We have a problem with people permanently settling. And here's why. First of all, it damages developing countries. Mary conceded in the questions that it's important for developing nations to have doctors, lawyers, and teachers, people who have intellectual capital, people who have brains, people who are productive, living in that country, helping to develop. My parents come from Nigeria, right? It's incredibly important for people in Nigeria to have these things, to have hospitals and schools and good universities. But what does her policy do? It creates a huge incentive for those people working in those countries who are productive, who need to stay there to develop those nations, to move to places like America and to places like the United Kingdom. Why is that bad? Well, Mary also conceded not everyone will be able to move. She still has some restrictions. So the unlucky people who get left behind because they don't meet Mary's quota are now stuck in a country where its doctors and lawyers and productive people have moved abroad. Why is that even more dangerous in an era of free trade? Well, lots of companies, when they invest in a particular area, want to see signs of human capital. They want workers around them to be productive. Look at India. They've managed to develop a huge IT base, and they see companies moving jobs. One of the reasons why unemployment is quite high in the US and the United Kingdom is because jobs are moving to India, because they've done a good job at retaining human capital. Where you draw people away from a country, and you push them towards other countries, no one wants to invest in that particular country. Furthermore, on a simple level, you lose good leaders, people who actually can help nations develop because they move abroad. So we should focus on developing free trade and making sure foreign direct investment can go into these countries to create jobs. So I would argue that Mary creates a more arbitrary situation because some people are left behind to an even worse country than it was before this policy was implemented. But my second argument is about the social harms. First of all, we would argue that often there's a backlash when lots of people move into an area and they take jobs. Unfortunately, and I think it's ridiculous, some people do subscribe to bigotry. Some people do hate the fact that their jobs have been taken away or are perceived to be taken away by people coming from abroad. And often you get people move into communities which are hostile towards them. But I think there's a much bigger problem. I've already argued why there aren't enough jobs to go around for a 50% increase. You increase the number of people who do not have jobs, where you increase the people coming into an high unemployment rate. Why is that problematic? It means people are more likely to turn to crime, for example. You often have huge crime increases. We see the number of people with unemployment increasing. Why is that particularly bad? Because people somehow conflate the increase in immigration or conflate crime with immigrants, with people who do not look like them. And it gives ammunition to fascists and the far right to paint all immigrants with the same brush, ladies and gentlemen. All immigrants, some of the immigrants that we probably need, all immigrants get tainted with that same brush. So I wish in an ideal world people were able to move freely. But unfortunately, there are constraints on our ability to handle crime, on our ability to pay social security for a lot of immigrants who come into these countries. And often that hurts everyone. So why is our case so strong? First of all, Mary's policy damages developing nations. It rips the heart out of communities. It rips the intellectual human capital out of these societies. And second of all, it creates huge social pressures on our countries around the world. And that turns people against immigrants. And it means that immigrants aren't even getting a better life because they can't find jobs and people become bigots towards them. That's why I stand proudly on side opposition. Thank you.
Do you think Americans have a greater right to live in the United States than Nigerians?
I think everyone has an equal right to have access to development. I think your policy hurts development. So actually, I think everyone has an equal right to be developed and to have prosperity, but you undermine that.
Okay, but why did Nigerians have a duty to stay in Nigeria and wait until the country's developed, whereas Americans don't have any duty to move to Nigeria to help them? So why do doctors in America, why is it okay for them to stay in America, but Nigerian doctors have to stay there because otherwise their country won't develop? Why do those individuals have a duty to their country?
If you're trying to claim that my policy is more arbitrary than yours, that's not true, because your policy is more arbitrary, because you damage developing countries. And you also have people who are still stuck there, right? So the harm of the arbitrary nature of where we're born is a bigger problem under your world.
You still haven't answered my question as to why those individuals have a duty to stay in that country and why they have to sacrifice their own lives for the rest of their country. Why is it not okay for them to leave and make their own life better? Why do they have a duty to that country?
Because when they move, if you have huge amounts of immigration to a particular nation, that often damages those nations in that particular region. And fine, you can accept that where we're born is fairly arbitrary, but what you have to accept is that the people who pay taxes in a particular region or the people who've settled in a particular region might have a backlash or might see unemployment rise. But also I do think people have a duty to not cause massive social harms to one particular society and create social harms in another particular society, which your policy does.
Okay, and the second question is, at the moment there are lots of countries from which you can migrate to. Why is it the case that in developing countries, the vast majority of people still stay there because of family ties and cultural ties? Why will that not be the case under my model? Why your picture of everyone just leaving, why is that not true at the moment when you can already move to lots of different places?
Well, no, you can't, because there are restrictions on immigration. Your policy increases those decreases those restrictions, so presumably more people would want to leave. And in fact, for your policy to work, you presumably want people to leave, otherwise you don't get the nice economic, cultural benefits which you claim would happen from lots of people moving.
Okay, right. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to deal my rebuttal speech just with two things, really, maybe three. This idea of the brain drain that Lewis brought up and why actually he both overestimated and misrepresented the point. And then also this idea about how it's not really just to deal with the problem of development in the way he's told you, and he's really ignored the kind of moral principle I've given you. One bit of rebuttal doesn't get into that, and this is this idea, two actually, this idea of unemployment and how in the UK, all these Polish people came over and it massively increased unemployment. This is not really true in that unemployment in the UK is actually fairly low in the country at the moment. But also the hundreds of thousands of people that came from Eastern Europe to the UK created a net gain to the economy. The economy increased because of the contribution they were giving, because they were doing jobs both people in the UK didn't want to do and couldn't do. We had a massive shortage of people like plumbers, and lots of people from Eastern Europe came and did jobs that we didn't have. So because people emigrate from a country because they want a job, they're not going to do that if there isn't a job they can go to, right? So they're only going when they can really fill a job, the perception that there is a job they can do. In the UK, most people took a job, so it's not really true how he's painted it. The other thing that Lewis mentioned that I'm going to cover is the idea that we shouldn't allow immigration because some people are bigoted and racist and won't like this. I don't think we should be pandering to the interests of some people who are not going to like the fact other people are coming to a country. We shouldn't let people who are bigoted and racist have dictate our policy on immigration, and just because they don't like people who are foreign, we shouldn't make our policy follow that. The response to that is to make sure we have better integration, better tolerance in schools. There's lots of other policies to tackle that kind of problem, not just to not allow people to come in the first place, because some people might not like it. This issue of the brain drain, a number of things. Firstly, Lewis still hasn't really answered the point as to why some people have a duty to stay in a developed country and help it develop, and other people are allowed just to stay in the developed world and watch it develop. Absolutely, we should be supporting developed countries to develop better. That's absolutely true. But why as well does this policy help it in lots of ways? Firstly, remittances. So when people come over from a country, a developing country to a developed country and work, they often send a large proportion of their wage back, which can be one of the best ways to fuel growth in countries. Lots of countries are highly dependent, and their growth is highly dependent on that kind of idea. But also there are natural safeguards. There are natural safeguards on everyone leaving, because people have cultural and family ties to a country. So it's not really true the way he's painted it, that lots of people will leave, but lots of people will stay and develop the country, with the added benefit of having skills and money sent back from people who are in the developed world. But that last issue is this idea about this just duty, because Lewis has said, well, the only reason this is okay is that some people will suffer more. We say we can tackle the fact that some people will be in developing countries still with helping those people like we should already do, right? By helping developing countries per se, not just because they have a trade benefit to us. But also, we still haven't tackled this issue of why some individuals have a duty to developing countries and others don't. When I asked do Americans and Nigerians have the same duty, the same right to live in the USA, he said absolutely, they have the same right to live in the USA. Why then is the law not recognising this? Why then is the law not allowing people to live here in the same way Americans can? We don't think there's any real distinction morally between people from different nations. There shouldn't be any in our immigration laws. I beg you to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is an open and shut case, right? So two things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about why this damages the developing world and the social harms. Let's talk about why it damages the developing world. I told you that when you rip out the heart of communities, where you take people, doctors, lawyers, potential leaders, educated people, productive people, out of an economy, and you put them in another country, the country that they leave behind crumbles, okay? It gets damaged. What did Mary say? Well, Mary said, well, there are these things called remittances, where you could get money, earn it in the developing world, developed world, and send it back home. First of all, that assumes you can find a job. One of my biggest arguments was that a lot of people won't be able to find a job. But second of all, sending money back home often isn't a substitute for having doctors and lawyers and productive people, right? You might be able to send, a quarter of your salary back home. But if a country doesn't have human capital, there are no people to teach students, okay? Money can't buy you those productive people. So unfortunately, that is not an answer to the fact that your policy destroys and damages communities in the developing world. You can literally go to the streets of Africa and you can see instances of where people have had their families move abroad. And that's fine to some extent. And that's why limited immigration is good. But the question in this debate isn't about whether or not this is an immigration or no immigration, but immigration as we have right now, or increasing the number of people around the world moving by 50%. That is a huge number, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look at the social harms. Mary told you, well, in the UK, unemployment is quite low. Unemployment in the richest parts of London and Birmingham in the UK is quite low because they're the richest parts. But often what you get is immigrants moving to communities which aren't the richest parts of the country, but actually are relatively poor, urban areas, okay? So in large parts of London, large parts of the country, unemployment is as high as 20%. So my question is, and her answer was, oh, well, these people can become plumbers, okay? So your policy would increase the number of people coming into the UK by 1 million people. I don't think the UK needs 1 million plumbers, right? So if that's the example that you think can win the debate for you, well, good luck. But I don't think a country needs 1 million plumbers, and there aren't enough plumber jobs for these people to take. So what do you have? You have people moving in huge droves to a country that hurts developing nations. But you also have huge people moving to an area where there are no jobs. So what happens? A lot of people turn to crime. A lot of people get portrayed as criminals, unfortunately, by the right-wing media. So what we say is that have a practical policy. You can have all the morals you want, but governing has to be based on pragmatic policy making. And we have to accept that the limits we have on immigration right now are about right, but we should channel our efforts to developing countries abroad, but not to the detriment of hurting countries abroad and countries here. We beg to oppose. Thank you.
All right, before we have discussion and questions, you're the judges. Now, as I said, these debaters are not arguing their personal opinions, they're trying to make the best argument for each side. And I want you to think not just about personal opinions, but which side did the better job of debating. So at this point, having heard both sides, I want you to think about, would you vote in favor of the proposition to greatly increase migration, or would you vote against? All right, are you ready to vote? All right. Do we use the meter? All of those in favor of the affirmation, affirmative? All of those in favor of the negative? Well. All right, so that's one for you, Lou. Are you keeping track? Aha, so we voted for the negative. All right, we have microphones here and here. We'd like to hear your questions and your comments. First about this topic, and then as we get into the 11 o'clock hour, we'll expand the discussion to whatever you want to talk about. So who has comments or questions? Come down to the microphone, please, and give your name, if you will, whatever question or comment you'd like, okay?
My name is Philip. Thank you all for coming. Okay. All right, my question is to the young man. Basically, I have to agree with the young lady when she said that people don't have an obligation to stay in a country that, they're sacrificing their lives, their family lives, when they can move to a country to improve their own lives, which is kind of selfish, but that's the American way. So my question to you is, your own parents, they immigrated from a former colony to the United Kingdom. So you're in a unique position to understand that. So do you really believe what you said earlier, that it's fair for someone to have to stay in a country when they can move and have a better life? That didn't make any sense to me, really. So that's my question to you.
Two responses. Okay, so whilst we do this, Q&A session, I'm going to still pretend I'm on the side. But two questions. One, I still think, obviously, no one has an individual obligation to stay in their country. That's why I think it's fine for a government to have a system like a lottery green card system, where people who want to leave can go into a hat and you can draw people, and then those X amount of people can become citizens of a country. So on an individual level, you can do everything you can to try and leave, but then I think there has to be a system in place to make sure the entirety of a nation doesn't move over. But the proposition also supports, though, the principle that some people, unfortunately, are going to have to stay in their home countries, because Mary's not advocating complete immigration. She's still in favor of restricted immigration. She just wants to increase it by 50%. So both sides, I guess, to some extent, have obligations to people who have to stay at home or who can't move to America or the UK. It's just about how do you want to manage the harmful consequences of that if you have 50% moving to another country, which I think is quite big.
I'm David Andrews. I agree with you in the point that, this isn't Michael Jackson's We Are the World, you know what I mean? People are definitely
Did I make that point?
Point is that, we're not all going to hold hands and everybody agree in certain areas and stuff, but I want to ask your opinion on refugees. Like, some people just don't have a choice. People need to get out because, of natural disasters or war-torn areas and stuff like that. So I was just wondering what your opinion was on that.
Where are my supporters? I thought I won this debate. Refugees come into a separate category. Obviously, if there's been a disaster or if people have, there's a danger that they'll be killed when they go back, I think obviously there is an obligation to not send people to their certain deaths. And I think you can do schemes like temporarily having temporary residence for a lot of refugees, and then after a while they get sent back, which is I know a system that the UK used for quite a while. But I think that, there's a distinction between people who are coming for pressing life or death needs and people who are coming to better themselves. And I think often, in many ways, we have to make a distinction, otherwise it won't be practically manageable.
Do you want to add to that, Mary?
Yeah, I think
You're good.
at the moment, in most countries, asylum seekers get either automatic or much different laws. So I think that probably is outside the scope of most of what we were talking about. But absolutely, I think, it's important that we give refugees somewhere to live when they need it.
My name is Michelle Uko. I'm an American, and I'm married to a Nigerian, and have an interest in this young man because I have 3 children in his age group. Realistically, I've been based in Nigeria for the past 10 years. I just got back about 2 months ago because my children are now in universities here. So it is true what he says. It creates a major brain drain in developing countries when people who are highly educated, the doctors and lawyers and all, remain in countries like UK and United States. So my question to him, is he going to be a part of that brain drain? Because he has finished Oxford and he has a job waiting for him. And I'm wondering if he's going to put himself in the same position as my husband, where 25 years later, because my husband went to Johns Hopkins, he finds it very difficult to go back home.
Difficult to get a job that he
No,
wants,
he has a
or
business, he's
just
doing very well. Difficult to integrate back. If you stay out too long, sometimes it's almost impossible.
it doesn't feel like
I mean, the
your
children and I
culture.
were based there, but he always has problems, being based there, trying to do business there, trying to understand his own culture.
I've actually only been to Nigeria 3 times. I was born in the UK. Obviously, most of my family live in the United Kingdom. In fact, I've got quite a large family living in Texas. So in terms of family ties to Nigeria, I don't have a huge amount anymore because they've moved around the world. Ironically, they've immigrated to lots of other countries. But, obviously, I take an interest in Nigerian affairs, and, I think it's important that everyone tries to do their best to help countries that are connected to by heritage develop. Whether I don't think I would live there because, again, I was born in the UK. I've got my friends and family there. And for me, that's the most important decision about where I live. So I guess that was sort of an answer, but not a full answer. And I imagine my parents, I don't know what my parents actually think. I think at some point they'd like to go back when they retire. But again, they've been in the UK for, 35 plus years. So again, they also have ties here. Not here.
And
in
see,
the
that
UK.
becomes a part of the Sparrow problem.
Yeah.
Like I said, I just left there, and then you have this group where they're very, very young, or even they're very, very old, where the people who can actually turn the country around, they don't go back home. So that is one of the problems. And so for me, I believe that the immigration laws should be more restricted, particularly given the fact that on my own part, my family has been here more than 300 years plus. And I feel like we build America, meaning the Americans who have been here in that category. So meaning not the new immigrants. So it's always this debate going back and forth. That just is my feeling. I believe that Nigerians in particular, I'm using his case because I happen to be married to Nigerians or other immigrants, should look at their ties to their countries as well. I know America is supposed to be a melting pot, but come on now, how long ago was that? So that to me is like very close to my heart. That particularly immigrants need to look at before coming here, their ties and making contributions to their countries where they're coming from.
Good, thank you.
Hi, my name is Megan. I would like to agree with the lady in front that we should all be given the opportunity to find ourselves and to define who we are based on where we want to live. We should be allowed to venture out, to test the waters, to see if where we were born is for us or if something else is better. And that the 50% rule is great because starting out initially, we are tied to our own country. But that if we do it gradually, there won't be such an uproar and such an outlashing to people coming in and already current residents having a total disdain towards it. But my question is toward the gentleman in the front. How can you be against her argument if you yourself are doing what she is initially trying to oppose, trying to, suggest, that we venture out, that we explore, that we take opportunities that we can be given and we run wild with them. So if you're running wild with these, say, liberties that you've been given, why are you now saying that you shouldn't run wild with them?
Okay, so just to clarify, think immigration is good, right? But that's different from saying I think there should be almost unrestricted immigration. Because unfortunately, you said, I think the phrase you used was to explore and discover ourselves and become better people. But obviously that's conditional upon you being able to go to another country and you being able to discover yourself and get a job and build yourself up. And a lot of people can do it, but I just find it difficult to believe that if you increase the number of people who immigrate into the United Kingdom by about 2.5 million to 3 million, you are automatically going to ensure that all those people, all those new people under this new system are going to be able to discover themselves, are not going to live in really poor accommodation or be homeless, are not going to be unemployed, are not going to have their kids not enrolled in school. I find that hard to believe. So there has to be a balance between making sure, as you said, people can discover themselves, explore, try and find a country that suits them, but also ensuring that people are not harmed in the process. And every policy is about balancing out ideals and the practical implementation of those ideals. So I agree with you in principle, but there's a practical question at stake as well.
Well, they like that answer.
Hello, I'm Masha, and I'm from Ukraine. So my question is to Louis. You mentioned about obligations, so all teachers and lawyers have to stay in their home countries to develop it. But I wanted to ask you if you know what they really do in their home countries. I'm from Ukraine, and I know what teachers and lawyers do. They actually go to Poland or to Turkey. They buy really cheap clothes and resell it because they can't find their jobs. So do you think they really contribute in this way? And isn't it really better for them to go to developed countries like the United States or United Kingdom and actually use their knowledge? Thank you.
Yeah, so why can't I still find it difficult to understand how you can expect a country to develop if there's a huge brain flight abroad, but also when there's no guarantee of those people getting jobs. I find that very difficult to believe. And actually, governments, I think, have to be responsible, and I think have to ensure that they don't have policies which are detrimental to other people around the world. I do think having an open door system or close to an open door system where people can move will hurt those people in those countries. I think teachers should be better paid in Ukraine. They should be better paid across the world. But you don't solve those problems by getting rid of all those people in the first place, right? You need people to be, you need leaders. I think the whole thing about payment, that's about leadership at the top. But those leaders often will study abroad and will reside abroad. And I think that might be damaging if we allow everyone to do that. That's just my position. I also just want to add that the positions I advocated in the debate may or may not be my true position. So read into that what you will. But just to put that out there.
Mary, would you like to comment? Everything's getting focused on Lewis here.
I thought I won this debate. Where's people who vote for this side? Give questions to Mary.
I think they're all right. The comments are great. They're on my side. I mean, I'm good.
Lewis feels like he won the debate, but you're doing all the challenging on Lewis, right?
My supporters have obviously left the room because it's so clear that this is on.
What's the deal? Yes. Mary, what do you think?
I think in the case of what Lewis is talking about, for example, people leaving the Ukraine to go somewhere else because they're not getting paid properly, I think we can tackle that problem, make people not want to leave by funding developing countries better so that things like hospitals and schools and things are funded better. That's, I think, a duty we should have as a rich nation. So I think we can tackle the problems that might come with immigration and people wanting to leave by trying to counterbalance that incentive and trying to make them want to stay by creating better incentives. I think that's one answer.
There's recent statistics from the New York Times that life expectancy in the United States is really surprising, that Hispanic Americans have the highest life expectancy now. And they're trying to figure out why that is. And there's a theory that the Mexican Americans, a lot of them, are the hardiest people that are coming over here, the ones that are in the best shape physically. And so you not only have a brain drain, you might have a drain of athletes and people that are physically healthy. And the danger is that Mexico may become a failed state. And I'm wondering what advice you give to the Mexican government, how to stem not just a brain drain from Mexico, but also the fact that the healthiest people from Mexico appear to be coming over here. And you really think that we can handle a free border from Mexico to the United States, that's going to help Mexico in the long run?
I think on the issue of like the different life expectancies, I'm not sure that's necessarily because the people leaving Mexico are the hardiest. I think it may be just due to like lifestyles of relative people in America and like healthy eating and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure necessarily, because I did read that article, I'm not sure necessarily the kind of the logic they inferred was right. But even if it was, I think firstly there's lots of problems in Mexico. I don't think we can really attribute the possibility of a failed state in Mexico due to emigration. There's obviously lots of historic problems with drugs and with like poverty and development, and I think we can tackle those problems specifically with outside help, with increased funding and leadership advice and governance. But I also think this comes back to the idea of, do those people who are wanting to leave Mexico and have the ability to leave Mexico, or should have the ability to leave Mexico, do they really have a duty to sacrifice their and their families' lives to make sure they save or have some kind of effect to help Mexico develop at the cost of their own lives? And I think it's quite a hard sell to say they do, if we're not saying that people don't have a duty to go. So, if there's a shortage of doctors in a country, where no one's going to say, Americans have a duty to go to that country because otherwise that country won't develop well. They accept that they can, pursue their own interests and stay, even if it's selfish, stay in their own country. So, I still think there's this question of whether or not any individual has an obligation to stay in one place just to help the nation, or maybe help the nation. But I'm sure Lewis has a response.
Just three things. I think one, it is just true that immigrants disproportionately have people who are better educated, almost, who are in better shape to actually get into the country in the first place. And often, lots of states have point systems for their immigrants. And so a lot of them would mean that you would get a high representation of people who are in good shape. But I think two things. Notice how in a lot of cities, even in America, when you have the middle class, or when you have a group of people who happen to be wealthy or influential, who move out from the urban areas to the suburbs, like you had in Detroit for the last 30 years, you often get the urban area becoming underdeveloped and becoming worse, okay? That is I think, a good example of how, if you apply that to a macro in a macro way, that can affect countries. But also, on this whole thing about duties to people to help other people, we restrict people's freedom massively by taking some of their income, putting it into a pot to help pay for the services of people who are poor. So all the time, governments restrict people's freedom through taxes, okay, to help people who are less well off. Okay, so the system of obligation, or the system of having a policy which might be unfair to some people because, you know, they might want to do something, always happens. So I don't see why that's a huge leap from saying only some people can move to this country, not everyone, in my opinion.
And I think that one of the secondary arguments you could make about opening immigration flow is that it would free resources away from regulating and hunting out illegal immigrants, that there's a tremendous economic cost, a judicial cost to our courts to identify, to stem illegal immigrants. Or more importantly, that they're already here, and because they are illegal, they are not being recognized, they're not being taxed, they're not being allowed to contribute to the economy in normal ways, so that there is an economic incentive or an argument to by increasing immigration and by increasing the cap, that the people who are already here or the people who want to be here could be regularized in the society and allowed to work, allowed to be taxed, allowed to vote, allowed to engage in the country in a way in which they're being underrepresented now and also underutilized.
Go to college.
Go to college. Right.
I mean, I actually think a policy of increasing immigration in this way will actually increase illegal immigration for two reasons. One, you create this perception that it's just much easier to get into America or the UK, which it is, but it may not be, you know, guaranteed. So what that increases is the amount of people willing to take more chances to come into the country legally. Because remember, Mary still supports restrictions. It's only a 50% increase. So presumably, some people will be turned away. But also, when you have the brain drain effect on the societies that they leave, you often make the situation there worse. And that again creates a spur for people to try and get into a country illegally. So actually, I think this actually doesn't help in illegal immigration that well. And I don't think there's a nexus between a policy that increases the immigration and people who currently benefit from not being registered to some extent, or who work in the illegal economy, or who have been trafficked, coming forward and registering as immigrants. I think often there are factors which stop people from wanting to be put on the official government register, whether their job depends on them not being officially recognized, factors like that. So I think this might be actually counter to that aim.
I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and particularly in the case of somewhere like Mexico, like we were just talking about, where obviously it's very hard to an extent to control the border anyway. So a lot of this immigration, I think, to an extent, is inevitable. In the UK as well, with some, you have a lot of illegal immigration, and I think the safety of those people often, because they can't access services or the police or education, like you were saying, is pretty important. So, and I don't really think that there's any increased incentive just by there being a change in the law. I mean, there's still going to be a limit. And in the same way there is at the moment, I don't think it would necessarily spur immigration. It would just spur people emigrating through safer means and actually accessing a route they know they can do if they really want to come here. So.
Hi, my name is Misha, and I'm from Germany. But I have a comment and a question that, let's say you take a group of 20 doctors from a third world country, and all of them are highly qualified doctors, but in their country they don't get paid enough. So with restricted immigration, 10 of them can come to America and get highly paid. What does that say to the other 10? Let's say we increase the number of amount, and then 15 of them come over to America. American doctors who are also highly qualified get unemployed. Now, what's going to happen is if all the 20 doctors stay there and actually do something about it and one becomes a humanitarian, stands up to the government and say, we need to be paid more as doctors, then the problem wouldn't exist in that country anymore if something gets changed about it. Because if they just come to America anyway, they're running away from the problem instead of standing up for themselves. And if that were to happen all the time, then this country today would still belong to England.
Okay, well, I don't think the problem ignoring the England comment there, I don't think the problem in developing countries is that doctors aren't asking for money and they're not standing up for themselves. And I don't think the answer to doctors being underpaid is them just saying we want more money, because I think that already happens. I think the problem is that there isn't the money and the infrastructure to do it. So I don't think that's the case. And I think we can tackle that problem by helping developing countries be able to pay their doctors more. But I also would just question your assumption that if they can, they will come here, because if you actually look at developing countries, a lot of people feel like they have a duty to and have a cultural and family tie to their country. So I don't think it's true that if you increase immigration by 50%, 15 of those 20 will necessarily come. But I equally think, why... But again, it's just this fact issue of whether those people should be forced to stay in those countries to sacrifice their own lives to make it better. I don't think there's any necessarily causal link between them staying and necessarily them getting paid more. I think we should just do a third option of just making sure that they can pay them more, regardless of immigration policy.
I mean, I find it a bit laughable that Mary thinks that if you decrease restrictions in immigration, there'll be quite a few people who would go, actually, no, I'll stay here and not get paid instead of going to America. Why are applications to get green cards or to get visas incredibly high? Why applications to get citizenship in the United Kingdom incredibly high? Because people want to move and people want to leave. But also, I think importantly, you have to remember that even if you assume that all the people who come into a particular area after they've immigrated can get jobs, what happens when you have lots of labor into a particular labor market? It depresses wages, okay? So you import a million plumbers. Plumbers in general get paid because there's plumbers everywhere. So, even if Mary's plan works that everyone can find a job, it's still detrimental often to those people who will probably get paid the same as the standard of living will probably be the same as it was back in their home countries because of that wage depression. So I think all these it's a very complicated issue. And that's why I think having managed migration is a much more sensible policy. And that's and governments and economists have worked that out.
Question?
Hi, my name is Julian Hoover. I'm actually about to be a little bit late to my next class just because I wanted to stay and ask this question real quick. But well, let me start off by giving an example. In the case of most house robberies, most home invasions, we have people who will target houses or homes that they're already familiar with. They've already been inside a few times, they know where everything is, so they could break inside and then get what they want and then leave. And well, of course they're going to get caught, but at least they'll go down with a bang. So how that relates to my question is on the issue of terrorism. And if we did open the door to free immigration and people could just move in between countries as they wish, and if we just allowed the society of people from another country to come into America and to get a feel for our country where everything is, then they could begin to pick apart the country from the inside. That's just an example, but do you believe that it would be possible for free immigration to increase the rate of terrorism? I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Or we have to
make us less safe, yeah.
Or will we have to implement some kind of system where we check the backgrounds of these people coming in from the other countries to see if they're a possible threat? Or
well, I mentioned at the start of my speech that the exception would be that there would still be checks for criminal activity to stop things like terrorism. So we would still check people's passports and papers to make sure known terrorists weren't entering a country. I also don't think necessarily that the thing stopping terrorists at the moment is that they can't live in the USA. And I really don't think, the vast majority of people from other countries aren't terrorists. And I don't think they would come in. Given people aren't constrained by the law if they're terrorists because they're prepared to potentially die to break the law, I don't think really increased immigration will increase terrorism. Actually, I think it will increase global integration and understanding, which can be one of the causes for people turning to terrorist means. So actually, I think if anything, it would probably increase understanding and global cooperation.
Well, I think in the general issue of crime, I just do think he will obviously increase the rates of crime because as I said, when people move into an area and they cannot find a job immediately, they often cannot communicate with people around them. They often don't have the qualifications that people accept in that nation. A lot of people need to eat, a lot of people need to survive, especially if they have a large family. So it's no surprise in areas of the UK, in areas of France, which has had the highest amounts of migration and also unemployment, what you get is people, like an increase in drug dealing, an increase in people working in the sex industries, for example, because it's a relatively easy way of making money until you can find a job. And I think Mary concedes that point. That's why she's not for completely unrestricted immigration, because she said in the question and answer session that otherwise that would create a lot of crime. I think if you increase it by 50%, you get a lot of crime. It may not be, 100% of crime, but a 50% increase in crime is still a big increase in crime, right?
Hi, I'm Michael Carter. I guess my question is, I'm an American baby. I'm with Lewis, because my question is right now, do you think it's fair to put more of a struggle on a country that's kind of working? At this very moment, our president, Barack Obama, is in other countries he's trying to, make peace with everybody. He's also trying to establish good communication with everyone. Now, we just had a recent election, and the House Representatives and the Senate, we just had a big issue with all of that, the Democrats in the Senate. So my question is, do you think it's fair to put more, not saying immigrants are a burden, because I love the fact that we have so much culture in America, and it's very beautiful. But the question is it fair to put so much more heaviness? Because if we open the border to Mexico, there will be more issues, even though a lot of people don't want to admit that. It will be more of a struggle. But for the ones that are here, that are trying to, like the fathers and the mothers that are, working hard to keep them, to work with America, then you have more people. Is it fair to put more of a burden on somebody? That's my question.
You mean more economic burden on the United States?
Thank you.
Okay.
I think you have to balance that burden with the burden of the individuals who want to better themselves and have a better life. So I guess that's the kind of balance. Should America sacrifice a small amount of its economic might and prosperity, remembering it's, vastly richer than pretty much any other country in the world? Should it have to sacrifice a small amount of that for people who would make a massive difference to their lives to be able to live in another country and work in another country? And I also don't think it's a net loss necessarily, or at least a complete loss and burden for immigrants to come to America. The history of America is that of immigrants being entrepreneurial and working hard and bettering themselves and subsequently their country. So I think if you look throughout American history, you see the value that immigrants have to a society, both economically and culturally and socially. So I don't think it's true that it's just a burden on the country to have more immigrants.
Well, let me put it this way. If it wasn't a burden and, increasing the amount of immigrants was this magical economic way of, driving yourself out of recession, why haven't governments around the world turned to that as a way of getting themselves out of the recession? Just open the borders. Obviously, it is a burden. Why? Because often there is a time lag between these people being able to find jobs. Okay, so in that interim period, especially when you're in a recession, often social security receipts increase. So the number or the amount of money governments spend on Medicaid, the amount of money spent on schools increases, right? I don't think this is the right thing to do in an economic downturn. I don't think it's the right thing to do actually in times of decent economic times. So to claim that right now, when unemployment is really high, when the deficit is incredibly high, that somehow increasing the number of people who need the state to support them is not going to be a burden, I think is slightly confusing and odd. So I agree with your question.
Basically, I think both of the sides were kind of fuzzy in the way they were presented, and that it's like on one side the lady was saying we need a few immigration boundaries, but in essence open the borders. On the other hand, the gentleman was saying we need to keep them where they are. I'm paraphrasing, so you can tell me if I'm wrong, but he's saying we need not to increase or decrease, but keep them where they are. So that's why I pretty much gave it to the lady, because even though I think it's extreme to just say open the borders, because that would bring chaos, I'm pretty sure. But, right now the immigration laws, the policy is not really working. There's so many people that are trying to get into the country, they're getting in illegally, and it's just not working. So it needs some reform. And countries like the UK and the USA have historically prospered by international trade and from immigration. So if we don't have immigration, lower birth rate, the country's not going to be as good. So obviously we need to fix this. But my question is going to be to the lady, because we're kind of focusing not on you. So the question for you is, when you were saying earlier, you said that the borders are arbitrary, and you cited international commerce and multinational corporations and familial diasporic ties, which all that is true. But as someone who travels, debating, I've traveled to Europe, South America, so I'm pretty sure that you would agree that country borders are not arbitrary. There's differences in culture in, say, the Western world and, say, out there in the East, the Asian world, the Middle East, parts of Africa. It's not the same. So I believe it's untrue to say that the borders are arbitrary. So I'm going to ask you about that. And then one thing that you said about the European Union, you said that that basically increasing immigration or lessening the boundaries of immigration worked for Europe and for the United Kingdom, but Europe has a common culture due to the Roman influence. So I'm not quite sure that is applicable to comparing, say, the Western world and the rest of the world. So that's my question to you.
Okay, on the first issue on the borders, I think there's a difference between places being different and distinct culturally and historically, and there being a meaningful value to a legal border. So I think, my experience in the US has told me that, the United States has as much diversity as Europe in terms of, going to different places. We've been to Florida, we've been to Detroit, we've been to Texas. They're all very different places, which would be, I think, at least as different as countries. Yet for arbitrary historical reasons, well, not necessarily arbitrary, but for historical reasons, it's one country. Whereas in Europe, there's lots of separate, very small countries which are very similar. So I think, that whether or not they're seen as different countries or different states doesn't have any meaningful difference in terms of how different places they are. So I don't think necessarily just because places have cultural and geographical differences mean that they should have legal differences, because whilst it might look different and be different in lots of ways, places can be very interlinked. And on the second question of Europe and a common culture, I think there's massive difference within Europe. If you look at the Scandinavian countries versus Spain, there's quite a big difference in culture, in economies, in how developed they are. There's a massive difference in wealth in countries like ex-Soviet states in Eastern Europe and a country like the UK in terms of how well developed they are. So I think there's a huge difference across Europe. But at the same time, the free trade of goods and services and people has been really beneficial to the whole growth of the whole area. I think it's fairly undisputed that on the whole, the European movement has enabled lots of countries to grow in lots of different ways, and really, and probably more importantly, has enabled lots of people to fulfill their lives as they really want to.
I'm sort of upset that you didn't vote for my side, because I feel my position was fairly clear, that I support the current levels of immigration. But obviously, you can support the current level of immigration whilst also arguing that the system around immigration should be reformed. So we should have tighter policing, or we should have a amnesty, sunshine type law, which several states have been considering. So that's my position with the status quo. But on this arbitrariness, first of all, I don't think because things have historically been arbitrary means the conclusion should be we should get rid of that arbitrariness completely. Obviously, how land and wealth was allocated to people around the world is fairly arbitrary, who inherited land, who got land in the first place. Doesn't mean I can come and chill at your house because, 500 years ago, the division of land was arbitrary. So obviously you have to have practical considerations. I think the problem with this line about, where we're born is arbitrary and the borders are arbitrary is that it sort of ignores the reality of the world, as you said. And I do think actually borders are quite distinct, and borders are quite unique, and historically cultures have been built up. So it doesn't necessarily become arbitrary anymore, and they actually are separate state identities. I mean, people from, I'm sure the border between, parts of states in the United States and other states were arbitrarily drawn at some point, but they have distinct cultures because as history has moved on, they've developed their own cultures and their own practices and traditions. So I don't think arbitrariness entails getting rid of that arbitrariness completely.
Let's do one more question on immigration, and then we'll transition to just open questions about their experiences and about cultures.
I actually have 2 questions. Is it
Okay.
Okay. My name is Patricia, and my first question was, how has each of your heritages affected your current view on immigration?
How was what?
How has your heritage affected your view on immigration?
So you want to know their personal view, not
Yeah.
the view they argued in the debate. All right, that's a different question.
Yeah. Yeah, so obviously the views we took in the debate were just decided by the fact one of us had to do each side, not necessarily our own views. My family came from, like, my ancestors came from Ireland, which isn't a very far emigration, but they came across from Ireland to the UK about 100 years ago. So I guess my kind of personal views on immigration are that people's lives can change massively by being able to move, and my family's did. So I think, yeah, that obviously makes me more prone to seeing the benefits of immigration to people. And in that case, they moved over to the UK as part of a mass movement of Irish people to the UK who built, like, the railways and the canals kind of in the Victorian times. So, and that also, I guess, so then as a result of that, I also see the value that a country can have economically by accepting immigrants, because Irish immigration to the UK massively boosted lots of things in the Industrial Revolution and that kind of thing. So I think on both sides, my very limited experience of immigration would kind of help me to feel that it's a positive thing. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously think immigration is a great thing. In London, I live in an area where 80% of the families in the area, in the entire area, have got a background that is non-British in terms of whether they're first generation or second generation, third generation. And it's an incredibly vibrant area which is up and coming. It's hosting the Olympic Games in 2 years' time. So I think there is obviously a huge value to immigration, but I think it should be done up to the point until social harms can be seen, or up to the point where it's not going to create massive economic fallout. And so with many things in life, I think these things are subject to pragmatic, practical evaluations. That immigration is great up until it becomes a serious social problem. I think actually that's a policy, that's a position that most people around the world would hold. And so I guess that's how it informs my opinion. You know, it would be awful, absolutely awful, if we had unrestricted borders at a time where countries were unable to absorb 10 million people coming into a country, which I actually think would happen if we had unrestricted borders to places like America or places like the UK.
Okay. And my second question is coming off of what you just said, basically, is both of you have your different opinions. Like, you have you're against it and you're for it. So do you guys think there's a midway point that can be reached to, you know, better this argument?
Well, I think in reality, outside of the context of the debate, we both probably similarly think that what Lewis just said, that immigration is great, and as long as we make sure that there aren't real harms, that's what I really think. I mean, some kind of variation on what I said. I do think immigration is really important, and people should be as free as possible to move throughout the world, with the caveat that we should be sure that we're not harming the country that's going to massively, and in turn harming the people that are moving there because they, you know, move to a country for this dream of a promised land, and they get there and it's so overrun with immigrants that both they and everyone else there can't benefit. So I think, I don't know, Lewis may disagree, but I think in reality we probably both do subscribe to a fairly middle ground point, that, you know, immigration is great, we should try and manage it as well as we can.
All right, thank you. Let's transition to just open questions about cultural issues. And Mary and Lewis are at the end of their tour, and you said you've been in how many states, do you know?
13.
13 states. So how about if we just kick this off by your summarizing some of your observations about American culture that sort of struck you as pretty different from back home in different parts of the country. And then, you know, you're welcome to join in with other questions you have. Many of you have lived in different places too. Sort of your observations about differences in culture.
Okay, I'll start. I think the biggest observation we've both probably had is just the enormous size and diversity of the United States, because the UK is a third of the size of Texas. So, we're just not really used to having such a big country, or we've had to fly a lot because we've been traveling between kind of quite diversely different areas of the country, and we're not used to like flying within the same country and getting off a plane hours later and still being in the same country. So that's kind of the biggest thing that's kind of shocked me. I knew how big America was, like in an abstract way, but I don't think I ever really realized how enormous it was. So and because of that as well, how different it is. So we've been to 13 states, and we started in New York, but then we went to Florida, which is obviously quite different. We went to Miami, and then we were in Texas, which is a whole other country of a state, and then we were in Detroit, which obviously has a completely different feel to it in terms of its history and what the issues there are. So I think the biggest thing for me has been the diversity, and we're both really interested in American politics, and I really follow it. So I think for me it's helped me to understand the kind of struggles that American politics has because of that diversity of different people and different opinions as well. I think that's the second thing as well that I've noticed, the diversity of like political opinion and kind of a range of points. In the UK, it's a much more kind of centrist, there's much more of a consensus on political issues. So the political debate, which has been something that's really interested me, is quite different here. We just don't have the same, particularly on the right, the same spectrum of beliefs. There's much greater consensus. So I think, the diversity of the country, it's been incredible.
Could you give some examples for people who haven't been to those other parts of the country?
Of the diversity? Yeah, so we started in New York, which I think is kind of similar-ish to Europe in lots of ways. Like, geographically, it looks kind of similar. And obviously, historically, has had a lot of influences from the UK, because the New England area. So that was, like, in some ways not that different to what we used to. And politically, a lot of the... we were anyway. We were in Ithaca at Cornell, which is quite a kind of liberal place, which is quite similar to the UK. So whilst there were differences, they still kind of felt quite at home. But then we went to Pittsburgh briefly, but then we went to Miami, which obviously has a massive Cuban influence. I think something like 80% of people in Miami are from Hispanic background. And that was really different because I've never been to a South American country, or even a Spanish-speaking country. And in Miami, we probably heard more Spanish being spoken than we heard English. And most of the food we ate was Cuban, which was great. And it was also really sunny, which is another big difference. We don't really get that in the UK. It was really hot and tropical. So I think that was a really big difference. You could really feel the influence of Cuban immigrants, because obviously if you can get onto dry land, you can emigrate from Cuba to the USA as a political refugee. So that was, I think, the biggest thing about Miami, that variation. Where else was interesting? So Detroit, I guess, is one of the other places that I think kind of highlighted a different part of America, which has been really hit by economic decline, not just in recent history, but over the last few decades. So Detroit really spoke to that kind of old industrial heartland of the USA, full of factories, but in lots of places now closed down factories. And so we got a sense of that urban American feel. And then I guess Texas is the other example I mentioned of a really different place. And again, the thing that kind of struck me about Texas was a state identity. We saw certainly as many Texan flags as we did American flags. Now in the UK, you don't see flags at all of any of the. You don't see flags. People don't ever fly flags of the country. So to see both state flags and the US flag, there was a pride in Texas about it being its own country. Obviously, because it has a massive history of being kind of invaded by lots of different countries. So now it has a really strong state identity, but also had lots of kind of unique things. So Texas, we really found there was a lot of love for guns, and that was really odd. We didn't really the UK doesn't have any kind of guns allowed, so I still am a bit shocked when people own guns. That was a big thing about Texas. I miss that lots of places. I'm sure Lewis will add things.
By the way, there's a Maryland flag behind you, just so you know, but we don't carry it around with us. You're right.
Yeah.
You want to see it? Here. You probably haven't seen that.
No, we haven't.
Maryland flag. A lot of British influence on it.
Yeah, it's German as well. Yeah, the Costa George. But
Yeah. No.
Observations?
Well, you've done all the sort of highbrow stuff. I think sports that seems to be really big in. I'm a big fan of soccer. I'm going to call it football actually, because this is a cultural exchange event, so I'm going to call it what it's actually called. So, football.
But if we're going to learn it, we have to know that it's.
Okay, fine. Football/soccer is the diplomatic way.
But it's FUT.
FUT.
Isn't it? FUTBAL? No? Oh, that's Spanish.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway, the game where you kick a football around into a goal is really popular in the UK. But I guess the equivalent is American football, and we've been to about 4 games, and I've really enjoyed it. So I guess seeing how involved communities are, especially with their local college football team, seems to be a big deal. But there's also basketball and hockey and baseball, which seems to be really big. We watched the part of the World Series whilst we were in Texas, actually, in the bar, and yeah, that was a great cultural experience. And the other thing I'd notice is like how cheap things are compared to the UK. Like I live in London, and London's like one of the most expensive cities in the world. So I'm always shocked when I see the prices of like meals and clothes and stuff, and particularly beer is just really cheap in America because you guys don't tax it as much. But yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty cool. So beer and sports, yeah. I guess it was a slightly low bow from politics and geography. But.
Can you think of particular experiences or things that people said to you that were sort of eye-openers?
I think the gun conversation, I mentioned this before, but whenever we discuss, we often meet lots of students at university, and we, maybe just mention the differences, and one of them often that came up was the gun issue, because, you can't have any kind of guns in the UK. And people who I just wouldn't expect would then go, oh yeah, I have a gun. And sometimes they'd be like, oh yeah, it's in my car, or yeah, it's just in my room. And when I first came to the US, I came once last year, and I arrived in the airport, and the policeman had guns. Now, in the UK, policemen don't carry guns. I know, right? So there's like a special squad of policemen called the armed police who, if there's like an emergency, will be called out. But in general, you never see, I don't think I've ever seen a gun in the UK. That's never. So the first time I came to the UK, and it was a policeman, and I was really scared and shocked by this. So the thought of people, to me, having guns in their home or just in their car, or like in some places, we went to a restaurant in Texas, like a nice Mexican, we were having lunch, and at the table next to us, there was a guy with a holster and just a handgun on his belt. Now, I just don't understand why anyone would need a gun in a Mexican restaurant.
Let's not get into that debate, though.
Apparently. That's not, I understand some people like their guns. It's just from a UK perspective, never having even seen a gun, it's quite a shock, I think, to have dinner next to someone who's got one in their holster. And I'm sure some people, some of you have guns and think they're really great, and I'm sure you're right. But from my perspective, I just don't understand it. I think it's a cultural, chasm, big difference.
That's on American, Mary. Anyway, I guess for me, I get asked this question everywhere I go, and it annoys me to some extent. Is do you watch Harry Potter? I don't. I haven't read the book. I haven't seen the films. I don't care for the films or the books. I don't. I mean, as far as I know, it's about wizards who fly around in a school and save the world or whatever. It doesn't interest me. Which is actually a bit unfortunate because my college, the college I was at Oxford, was a lot of Harry Potter was filmed there, and the dining hall was actually going to be filmed in the dining hall I used to have dinner in. And I think there's this scene in one of the films where someone or something gets turned into an animal in a tree. Does anyone? No one here watches Harry Potter too?
I did.
A squirrel gets transformed. Anyway, that shot was shot in my original revision spot in college, where I used to just sit down on the grass and read. So I guess I should watch the films. But I guess that's the thing that's really stuck out for me. Everyone asking me that question. I'm being disappointed when I've said no. Are you joking?
Which tells you that Americans don't know much about the UK except Harry Potter, right? Questions? Come down to the microphone, if you will, so we can hear you. But we'd be interested in hearing your questions.
Well, maybe you can hear me.
No, use the microphone, please, if you don't mind. Thanks. I'll share with you a story I heard from the debaters 2 years ago that I still can't quite forget. They were in a hotel in Arkansas, and the chambermaid in the hotel was coming in to clean their room as they were leaving. And she said, "Where are you from?" And they said, Great Britain. And she said, "Well, you speak English really well." Kind of worries you about the knowledge of Americans. I said, "And did you say we created English?"
Hi. My question is, since you were here during the World Series, so you were here during the election, what was your opinion of the election, everything that you're hearing, and the discourse that you hear in America?
You might have to back up by explaining a little bit about the sort of the range of political views in Great Britain versus the U.S.
Yeah. So there's lots of differences, I think. I think in terms of political opinion, in the UK, the right-wing element of politics is much less right-wing. So the Conservative Party, which is the right-wing party, for example, advocates a completely free on the point of use healthcare system. So they advocate a universal healthcare system. Issues like moral issues, which are issues in American politics like gay rights or abortion, or that kind of a religious issue, just aren't really issues in the UK. There's kind of it's not discussed, I think, is the big difference. There's consensus on issues like abortion and gay rights. No politician in the UK would ever mention religion.
Wait, when you say consensus, on what side of those issues?
On what would in the US be a liberal side. So we have civil partnerships in the UK, and I think probably will turn into civil, like a kind of gay marriage at some point.
And it's not a big issue, you're saying?
No,
it's not a big controversy?
Not anymore. I mean, it has been in the past, but now it's not. And abortion is it's a right to abortion, and it's provided by the state, and it's free. And that's, again, not controversial, that no politician would advocate getting rid of that right to abortion. So I think that's one of the big issues, that there's a consensus on lots of issues. So we had an election in the UK in May, for example, and the issue was, I mean, there was ideological debate, absolutely, but the issue was how do we fight the economic crisis? Because there's obviously big economic problems in the UK, and we need to cut our massive deficit of debt. So the discussion was, where do we cut the deficit, and which services will create a better economic outcome? Not really ideological issues necessarily about rights that you have in the US. That's the big. And the other issue I think we found with the election is just the way the election is conducted is quite different. So in the UK, an election's called, and then 4 weeks later you have the election. So the campaign lasts for 4 weeks rather than like 2 years, like in the US. And there's big limits on how much you can spend, and you can't have TV adverts except the state-run ones at a very specific time. So things that shocked us were things like the negative adverts and the fact that the TV is full of adverts campaigning for political positions, because we don't have any of that. So sorry, Lewis.
I mean, I think, yeah, Mary's absolutely right. There is, I think, with the main parties who contest who have got a reasonable chance of forming a government, there's a consensus amongst lots of social issues and economic issues to some extent. But I think that there is a reasonably large, reasonably significant fringe party movement called the United Kingdom Independence Party or the British National Party, who are effectively, basically a racist political party, and are part of the far right. And I think a lot of issues that a lot of people, basically because the main parties don't really have any disagreement on those issues, a lot of those people move towards the fringe extremes of those extremist parties. So in the European elections a couple of years ago, the British National Party, the far right party, got about 1 million votes, right? So it's not to say that these people's opinions are homogenous in the UK, just that in terms of the reflection of the political system, the parties who control the country tend not to split on those particular issues. But in terms of American politics, I think just how vitriolic I think a lot of the campaigning has been and the rhetoric has been, especially the anti-Pelosi, anti-Obama rhetoric often in the media and in people's campaign ads. And I think it's really interesting because although people did dislike Gordon Brown, it was nowhere near as extreme or as passionate as people's dislike, or some people's dislike of Pelosi, Obama. I think we heard a story that, there was one of the churches, one of the pastors said to his congregation, pray for Obama to die. People wear their politics on their sleeves, I think, in this country, which I think is the big difference from here in the UK. I think.
Wow. Two questions, really. First off...
would you say your name?
My name's Scott. Question about really the Texas culture. Actually, I grew up in Texas, and so I've really experienced that. But what about the Texas culture, besides the gun issue, and the nationalism? It seems like there really was the pride in Texas. Besides that, what really intrigued you about that whole mindset? And then also the second question is, why isn't there very many differences in the political landscape in the UK? Why is it so really just one-sided, really?
So on the Texas issue, yeah, I feel a bit bad now. I feel like I painted a very bad picture of Texas. We actually did 4 stops in Texas and had a really good time, so we did really like it. I think more generally about Texas, I think there seems to be a really, I felt anyway, a really kind of acute recognition in Texas of the history of being invaded by lots of countries and being owned by lots of countries, both in terms of the effects of that, in terms of having a heritage. You know, there are areas where there's a really strong German heritage and areas where there's really strong Spanish heritage. So I think it's interesting in that sense, in that it feels very like it's had a lot of historical effects of different countries. But the other result of that, I think, is a really strong sense of wanting to have freedom and independence, which is really understandable. And it makes a lot of sense in the context of having been controlled by other places, that now there's a really strong sense. I mean, some people we met, you know, were in favor of Texas seceding from the Union. I mean, not many, but there are people obviously that think that. But even those people that wouldn't go that far, still have a really strong sense of wanting to have state independence, to, you know, to have control of their own lives. So I think that was interesting. But the other things about Texas, we had really good food in Texas. So another plus of Texas, there was a great Mexican and lots of really nice food. And a lot of food, really big. Everything's really big in Texas. It's really big, like the buildings and the everything. Do you want to take the second question?
Yeah, I mean, with regards to the second question, I think the electoral system means that, you know, because there are 600 and something seats, and on an individual seat, it's a winner, you know, takes all. So you just need to get more than the other parties and you win. And often those seats are contested by at least 2 or 3 parties. It forces the major parties who want to be successful to appeal to moderates, because, you know, you can't necessarily rely on your base to turn out and just, you know, move to the right or move to the left, because there'll often be another party much more extreme than you who will be able to capture votes from that bloc. And often there'll be parties who are centrist who will be able to take votes as well from moderates. So you really need to be a catch-all type party, especially in the UK, in order to actually form a government and to get a majority. You need to be able to win university seats, which are traditionally pretty liberal, very liberal, urban seats, which tend to be left-leaning, and also seats in the countryside, which tend to be a bit more right-wing. So to be able to win all those type of seats, you need to be able to form quite a moderate platform. And I think actually that's why the 2 big parties, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, on lots of issues there aren't a huge amount of daylight between them on lots of issues. But also I think the second reason why that there seems to be a bit of a political consensus and it seems to be narrowed, is that certain political reforms have happened after huge societal events. So our healthcare system was a product of World War II. And it was introduced after World War II. And no one wanted to oppose a system which would have provided everyone with free healthcare at the point of use after one of the most devastating wars in human history. And so both the left and the right agreed at that time. And so because the NHS has been sort of locked in this sort of...
Can you say what NHS is?
Sorry, the National Health Service, the organisation that runs health in the UK. Because it has such a high esteem and because there was a historical consensus that has been left untouched, I think, today, because, you know, it's connected with war and it's connected with, you know, building a new nation after war. So I think that specific reason is why I think we've had such an embrace from both sides on that particular issue. On issues such as gay rights and issues such as reproductive rights, we also are part of the European Union. And often, I mean, in Europe, there is a strong liberal consensus that actually pushes the agenda. So we've incorporated the European Convention of Human Rights, which actually protects individual freedoms in a pretty strong way. So I think European influence has also been a reason why both parties, you know, I mean, the alternative would be pulling out of Europe, which no party is going to advocate. So I think that sort of is a convoluted way of explaining why our politics is like that.
Could you talk about the issue of whether people who are poor in the UK have access to universities?
Universities. Mm-hmm. So in the UK...
To going to university.
Yeah, in the UK universities, it's going to change. There's a kind of discussion at the moment about changing that. So putting that aside, the current system is that universities in the UK are subsidised massively. So anyone going to university pays £3,000 a year fees, which is about $5,000. But the government will give you an interest-free loan to cover that. And then you pay that back after you've been earning about £15,000. And it's the same for every university in the country, so no university can charge more than that. And the other issue is that the other part of that is that you get a loan to cover your living costs, which again you pay back once you're earning a kind of reasonable amount.
So in fact, Oxford
And you
and
get
Cambridge
grants.
cost the same as any other university.
Exactly, yeah. So there's no increased cost to going to Oxford or Cambridge. And you get
actually-
grants if
yeah.
if you're of a low-income family, then the government will give you grants. So that's not non-pay back. You don't have to pay it back to cover your rent and your accommodation and everything. So there's still some problems with access to university in the UK, largely because of how people perceive it, and people are worried, understandably, about getting into debt. If they have come from a background where they've got a history of debt. So there's still some problems, and it's not perfectly equal, but in general, you don't need your family to have to pay for your university if you come from a poor background. And in principle anyway, and there's no distinction between universities. In principle, it should be a entirely, accessible system, and it to an extent is. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, no, just to say, if you're a poor student, you won't pay for university at all, because not only are there government grants, they're also university grants. So actually Oxford and Cambridge have the most generous grants in the country, because they, about 25%, about 20 to 25% of undergrads actually receive some sort of grant, whether it's a full grant or a grant that covers tuition. So the problem is information, and getting that information to parents and to schools and to prospective students.
Hi, my name is Tia Holmes. I noticed that you all have an interest in politics, and one of you has a future in politics. Congratulations on that. But I wanted to know what influenced your interest in politics. Is it the state of the government, or is it just the passion for helping people?
Well, I studied politics at university, so I was interested in politics when I was kind of younger. For me, actually, it was probably partly because my granddad was involved in local politics, and that got me kind of interested. And I think I just find it quite a fascinating question of how or if a government can change the lives of people through its policy. And historically, looking at different changes in government policy and how that's affected people. I found it interesting. I'm not actually going to be a politician. I'm just going to work for them.
Yeah,
but,
that's what she says. That's what she says. That's what they all say. Yeah, yeah. I'm sure. Yeah. I guess for me, I grew up in a house where everyone talked about politics all the time, and CNN was always on. Both my parents really care a lot about, particularly politics back in Nigeria, but also politics in the UK. So I guess it was just part of my upbringing, I guess, to be involved in and interested in politics. My brother and sister actually sort of rebelled against that and don't actually care about politics, but I sort of enjoy talking to my parents about politics and stuff. And I think as well, doing debating also, I think, made me much more aware of the world and how the world works, and whether or not certain systems are the right type of systems to have in place. And I guess that fueled my interest. And I started debating when I was 13, so I guess those two are the reasons why I'm interested. Certainly not because of the pay.
Yeah, I have to put the plug in. I forgot to do that earlier. We do have debate in this on this campus, and I teach it, and it's in the spring. So if you want to learn to be a debater, you can do that.
Okay. Hi, my name is Isita. Actually, I have 3 questions, not that much. Number one, the first question is, why do England still have a monarch system? And what is the role of the Queen in British politics today? Number 2.
Why don't you wait? Let's answer that one.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't know why do we have somebody called a king or queen who rules everyone as subjects and who's the sovereign of the country? I don't know. I'm a massive Republican in a sense. I believe that we should have a Republican form of government and not have a monarchy. So that's Republican with a little r. And so I'm puzzled by it. But I think it's one of those things which there's no massive harm from having a queen or a king. And actually quite a lot of citizens from abroad, from the former Commonwealth countries and current Commonwealth countries, actually like the fact that there's a queen. It sort of makes sure that there's some sort of common tie between the UK and its former colonies. I also think as well, the Queen can be quite a useful figure at times of national crises. During the Blitz, when London was bombed, the Queen was a big figurehead. When various incidents happen, the Queen can be someone to rally around. But ultimately, I think there's like a million things that need to be fixed with the UK, and probably getting rid of the monarchy is like 1,000,001
on the list.
To
So I think that's why.
To clarify the part of your question about the role the Queen plays, it's like pretty minimal. Technically, the Queen is the head of state, but and technically she has to sign every law to agree to it and like choose the Prime Minister. But in reality, the Queen never ever would not sign the law and just chooses whoever the electorate votes for. So in reality, her role just is like making speeches sometimes and like waving at people pretty much and opening schools and stuff, shaking hands, exactly. So in reality, just like that, yeah, is doing a Queen.
She's also our commander-in-chief of our
She's
troops.
technically, yeah, but she's like 85 apart from anything else or something. She's not gonna, command the troops anywhere. So in reality, she's just like doesn't do anything. And the thing that annoys some people is that they do get money from the taxpayers. Like the royal family get like millions of pounds to have like crowns, which
She also
annoys some
can't-
people like me.
She also can't be prosecuted.
She's above the law. Yeah, and luckily she doesn't commit crimes that we know of anyway. But interestingly, the next in line, Prince Charles, is much less popular than the current Queen. So there's a question of maybe when the Queen dies that it will become a bit more just like of a debate because people don't really like him, whereas the Queen is kind of harmless and she smiles.
I actually also think, just to add, I think the other reason why the UK still tolerates the Queen is because the last time a monarch tried to screw around with the people and take liberties, we cut his head off. So I think I think the settlement was that it's okay to have a monarch, but ultimately we retain the power to kill them, which is it's a very bizarre sort of way of thinking about it. But I think that the way Parliament works right now, the way our government works right now, is a settlement as a result of the civil war we had quite a while ago. So I think history is also a big factor in why we were able to tolerate monarchy.
Okay. My second question is, does England have a free health care system? If you guys do you think it will work for America? And the third question,
We'll save that. Let's
Okay.
answer that. Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, the UK has a system of it's obviously not actually free because you pay for it in taxes, but a system of free healthcare, free at the point of use. It's free. You just go to a doctor and it's free. Pretty much how it works. Do I think it worked for America? I think ultimately, it could work for America. There's enough money in America. It's such an economically prosperous country that in principle it could work. But obviously there's huge challenges to how it gets administered. Because in the UK we do have private hospitals, but a very small number compared to our national hospitals because the state just kind of bought up everything, in the 1940s. So it's much easier then than now. There's an established system there's now an established system of free healthcare, government-run healthcare, and kind of everything goes through the state system. And the private system is kind of on the side, but a much smaller part of the whole system. So I think it's obviously much harder for America having established the system as it has with all the kind of infrastructure belonging to private companies. So either you have to pay private companies, which is a very expensive way of doing it, or you have to try and establish a rival, which seems, implausibly difficult, or kind of buy up these companies. So obviously there's a lot of challenges, but I think ultimately, if there's a will, given the wealth that America has, there's no reason why they couldn't ultimately get to that end, I think. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, the UK had an insurance system in terms of its healthcare before we created the National Healthcare Service, the National Health Service. And, maybe it takes a big shock like a war to get something like that in place. Can it work here? Yeah, I think I think a system where people literally will cut their life expectancy short by almost a decade or more compared to the average because they can't afford what I think is a basic universal right, the right to have healthcare, I think is an odd system. I think any system which can avoid that, whether it's by a public-funded national healthcare service or some sort of combination of a private system and a public system, I think would be good. I think the end should be, though, making sure that nobody is denied healthcare because of what a health insurance company thinks about their risk or because they can't afford it. I think the vast majority of countries around the world have accepted that government needs to be involved in providing healthcare because sometimes the market isn't a good allocator of that.
Okay, the last one actually is of politics. This is about sports. For the past couple of years, American football has been played in England.
American
Football.
Not American soccer.
No, football.
American
We-
football.
no.
Okay.
We
Let's
call
be
it
clear,
American
right.
football.
You're saying the NFL is
Yeah, the
going to
NFL,
England, to
yes.
Great Britain to play
Right.
games.
For the past 2 weeks, I guess, a game was played there. How is that sport important in England? And finally, why is it that you guys don't have cheerleaders in any sport?
I ask that question every day. No,
And I always ask, why do we still do that in this country?
Well, okay. To answer your cheerleader question, I think because American football there's lots of pauses. Like, you need to have lots of stuff going on during the game to keep people's attention up because there's timeout stuff. In like soccer, it's just continuously flowing. So you could have cheerleaders, but no one would pay attention because they're watching the game. So I guess that might be a practical reason. But in terms of, halftime, yeah, maybe. I will write to the head of the football league in the UK and suggest, I went to America, fact-finding mission, and the big recommendation is we need cheerleaders. And I'm sure it will happen. In terms of the NFL taking off in the UK, it's really hard to displace a national sport. It's very difficult because communities are tied up to a sport. There's lots of passions, lots of history, there's lots of money involved. So I don't think the NFL will take off. And I think it has a long way to go, primarily just because football is the sport that's played in schools, and rugby is the sport that's played in schools. And I don't think schools are willing to invest money in sort of, building American football stadiums or, providing protective gear for people when they play. So I think there's a big cultural barrier, and I don't think it will take off, sadly.
Yeah.
My name's Robert. I've also traveled the world a bit. My biggest question is, why do you think the culture is different between the US and Europe and the UK?
Oh, that's quite a broad question. There's lots of things I think are different. I think one of the things, just because we're talking about sports, that strikes me is that the kind of competitive spirit is, I think, much more prevalent in the US than it is in Europe and the UK, both in terms of how people treat sports, although there is a big thing, particularly for soccer. But I think it just seems to be more pervasive in all areas of life, this competitiveness, which I think you don't get quite so much in Europe and the UK. What other cultural differences are there?
I think, I think the biggest reason for the difference is I think in part because Europe has been a continent which for the past millennia has fought each other and have had numerous wars with each other. And I think when you are a country on its own, surrounded by water, I think the mentality is different. You don't have to worry about your neighbors as much. You don't have to worry about cooperation as much. And I think certainly after World War II, I think there was this massive reaction to the fact that for the past 1,000 years, our countries, all of Europe, has just basically been fighting each other. And so we need to create a new system where we can make sure that we don't do that. And I think that shared experience has meant that we have sometimes gone down different paths. So cooperation and a community, I think, has become much more of a focal point around Europe, hence why you have the rise of the social democratic movement. I think, individualism to some extent and more of a free market has been the dominant source of, I think, economic organization in the USA. I think in part, yeah, because of history and because of we need to cooperate in Europe more, hence why we have the EU.
Yeah, there seems to be a very strong sense of freedom and independence in the United States, both in terms of individuals being free and independent and the country being free and independent. Perhaps partly because of the history of Britain owning the US very unjustly. I guess that the kind of a struggle of independence, I guess, creates that idea both that individuals and a country has a right to exist on its own. And just the UK and lots of European countries haven't been through that in the same way. So I think that's one difference.
All right, so my name is Will. My first question is, what's the similarities and differences between the UK and this area, the metropolitan area? And my second question is, if you had to live anywhere in the US, where would it be?
Between this area and the UK, we've only been here 48 hours, so this is going to be a very unrepresentative guess. I think like it looks kind of similar, particularly DC compared to, we were in DC yesterday, DC compared to like someone like Paris, or like it looks really European in its architecture and stuff. So I guess like it looks kind of similar to lots of places in Europe. I don't know, I don't feel like I've been here long enough to make any kind of judgment. I don't know, what do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't, for my sins, I haven't been to many places outside. I've lived in places outside of London. I'm, a London guy. I love London. I think there are lots of similarities between DC, or not DC, between areas like metropolitan areas and London, obviously, because they're the same type of area. And so I think, yeah, just in terms of the feel, in terms of the number of people, I think we've been in a few places in America where there hasn't really been many people, i.e. like 10 people living in the town. So I think that's been a big difference as well. What was the second question?
Where would you live?
Where would I live? Oh. I'm a big fan of like weather, and I'm a big fan, like hot weather, and I'm a big fan of, I like stuff happening all the time. So I don't know, maybe Miami for a bit. I'm not sure if I could live, from what I've heard, it's a good place to visit, but not a great place to live. So I'm not sure. Maybe New York, but then it's a bit cold sometimes. I don't know. A big city, definitely.
Yeah.
Is DC? DC probably then.
Gets
yeah.
real hot, he said, yeah.
Solved. Problem solved. Damn, DC, I'll move to DC.
Yeah, no, somewhere on the East Coast. We haven't been to the West Coast. We're going to San Francisco tomorrow, but we haven't been to the West Coast yet. But somewhere like the New York area, maybe. I like Boston and New York. And DC is good too, so far. I don't know.
I'm still David Andrews. So a little bit about me. My family is predominantly from England, so I'm big into like punk rock and Chelsea and stuff like that. So, but a lot of America's politics is based on its geography. If you move more towards the center, it becomes more red, and more towards the East Coast and West Coast, it becomes more blue. And since England is much more constricted, one, how does your politics reflect its geography? And two, is it kind of similar, like your geography, do you operate under like counties, like how we have here? Like, is it, or like how is your smaller governments composed, you know?
Okay, so I'll take on the point of how the country is organized, we do have counties which are like probably a similar size to your counties in the US. Which have like local councils and like a mayor and stuff, which have quite limited powers, but on local levels do things like litter collection and stuff, not very much stuff. But we also have, because the UK is made up of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have their own parliaments, which have some powers. Scotland has slightly more powers than Wales and Northern Ireland, but they can do some things like they can affect education policy. They can affect like lots of other things. They can't change massive things like defence, but they have some power. In terms of geography, the urban areas tend to be much more Labour supporting, which is a left-wing party. Wales and Scotland tend to be more Labour supporting too, and then the countryside tends to be more right-wing in general. But
there's a big north-south divide in the UK to do with culture, and also to do with the economy. The South tends to be much more prosperous, less reliant on mining communities and manufacturing, which have declined. And so obviously that manifests itself in the North being relatively pro-working class, pro-Labour Party supporting area. Obviously the big cities as well, which tend to have a lot of immigrant communities, which also tend to have lots of universities in them, also tend to be quite left-leaning. And then, as Mary quite rightly said, it's the big countryside areas, parts of Middle England, parts of the south near Cornwall don't really vote. They're sort of centre-right, right? And I think that sort of explains. So yeah, there are geographic differences, and actually, in reality, the election is fought over sort of the Middle England, and who can sort of get that type of non-urban, non-university seat, sort of swing type constituency out to vote for them, and that's where the elections are fought.
Just to clarify, unlike your system where you vote directly for a president, in our system you vote for a local member of parliament, and whichever party has the most number of members of parliament, their leader gets to become prime minister. So to win an election, you just need to win a certain number of these seats.
How do you feel about Ireland's struggle for independence?
Northern Ireland, or you mean like the historic?
The southern part. Well, which was it that is?
Northern Ireland, yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel about that?
I don't have that much of an
I
opinion.
mean, I'm in the same way I feel about Scottish independence as I feel. I'm indifferent. I mean, if they want to
If they
become
want
a
to.
country, they can. I don't think it would be in their economic interest
Yeah.
to leave one of the most prosperous countries in Europe and the world. But if they want to secede and somehow get the representation that they get, which they won't in Europe and on at the UN, and sort of get the foreign direct investment or the investment which they get from the British government, which I don't think they'll get if they're independent. They can if they want to. I think a lot of.
You don't feel that maybe that Ireland is weak, I guess, but like as far as being like if Ireland was to be its own state, then it would be weak in the European Union.
Well, I think so. Like, I think a lot of people in England don't really. I mean, would prefer for Scotland and for Northern Ireland to stay within the kingdom, but ultimately realise that actually, if you look at it financially, there's a net transfer from England to Northern Ireland and from England to Scotland. So, I just don't believe that Northern Ireland would be in a better off state economically if it left the kingdom than if it joined it'd have to apply to join the EU in the first place. I wouldn't get the same amount of income transfer that it gets right now.
Yeah.
I introduced myself earlier as Misha, and from football fan to football fan, I'm talking about the FIFA Cup.
Yeah.
Do you believe that video cameras and replay should be used to determine if a goal is a goal or not? Keeping in mind that in 1964, Germany and England were in the final, and England kicked the ball, did not go in, but everyone said it did go in, and that caused Germany to lose.
Well, it did actually go in 66. It actually did go in.
66?
Yeah, it did go
sorry.
in. It did go in. I completely agree. I think there should be video technology. I think I can't actually think of a single reason why you wouldn't introduce video technology. I tried, I couldn't, and I'm not bad at coming up with reasons for something. So I'm shocked it hasn't happened, and I completely agree with you. I mean, lots of sports use video technology these days to on them, and I think football needs to move into the 21st century.
Okay.
I agree.
I could not care less. I mean, either way, I don't watch soccer or football or whatever you call it, so, it seems like a sensible idea to me, but it doesn't bother me in the slightest.
Then the question is for him, not you.
My question is about the American Revolution.
Would you tell your name?
My name is Edward Santos. My question is about the American Revolution and how it's taught in Great Britain. Here in America, coming up in school, they give a lot of importance to the founding fathers and the whole revolutionary struggle. We learn about every single battle in the revolution. We learn, many details about the American Revolution. So I was wondering, in Great Britain, do they give a lot of importance to that struggle here in America, or is it just another event in terms of British history?
I think most school kids wouldn't even be able to tell you anything about the revolution. I mean, I think a lot of people wouldn't even work out that the revolution was a battle against the UK. And that's, you can read into that what you will, because we don't want to big it up that much.
But you're saying most people wouldn't even know that it was the UK that was involved in that?
Yeah, I never covered anything about America in my history in school, not once. So, a lot of people I know from my school probably wouldn't even know that the UK used to colonize America and that there was a battle. I mean, that really isn't taught at all.
But I think also because Britain has been, no offense guys, but Britain has been around for quite a while and it's sort of existed for longer than America, that obviously your revolution was a big historical event because that was the birth of your nation, whereas there's a lot of British history to cover. We've got the World Wars, and then we've got the Wars of France, and then we have William the Conqueror, and we have the Great Schism between Catholicism and the creation of the Anglican Church. There's a lot to learn. So don't be surprised if we put the revolution to the side of it.
My name is Abdul. I'm a bit of an entertainment junkie, and I see a lot of American Hollywood media. seems to spread around the world. It creates phenomena and sensation. I was wondering if you guys have any recommendations for television shows or films that are strictly British that you think so we should as Americans should watch and enjoy.
Good question.
Yeah,
What
we
should
get-
they look for on the internet?
Well, most of our TV and film is American, so you're right. So most of what we watch in the UK is American. I don't really watch a huge amount of TV. The one thing I do like is The Office, which you have the American version here, but the British Office is much better, I think. Although lots of people have said they don't find it that funny, so maybe it's like British humour. Maybe that's not a good recommendation. Lewis watches much more film than I do, so.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we produce some films, and they're good films. We don't produce many, but when we produce them, they're good. I would say, like, the gangster films, like Snatch and Long Stock, are good films. Billy Elliot is a good film.
That's a great film. Yeah.
The History Boys, no? Okay. See, a lot of the films wouldn't really make sense to Americans because a lot of them are really about or people who aren't familiar with England, because they really are about communities in the UK, and there's lots of in-jokes. So I was going to say, in terms of TV show, I love a TV show called The Thick of It. No one has heard of it, right?
What's it called?
It's called The Thick of It. It's
The Thick
about,
of It.
it's like a comedy version of The West Wing. But a lot of the jokes you wouldn't, it's just hard to get unless you really, really, love British politics. So I could recommend you those stuff. I mean, Doctor Who.
Doctor Who.
You've got the Doctor Who fan club in the corner. The cool kids at the back. So yeah, I'd recommend those shows.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your time.